In 1914, Europe expected a fast war. A few decisive battles, a quick collapse, and victory would be claimed before the year was over. Instead, the fighting stopped moving and began digging. Across the Western Front, the ground itself became the last form of protection against a new kind of industrial slaughter. What started as shallow ditches turned into vast underground systems where survival depended on staying still rather than advancing. For the German army, this shift wasn't temporary. It became a strategy. These trenches weren't built for heroism or glory. They were built to endure artillery, machine guns, and time itself. But what happens when a defense becomes so effective that it traps everyone inside it? How did engineering meant to save lives also lock an entire war into endless attrition? To understand that, we need to go back to how this war stopped moving in the first place. In the summer of 1914, the war began with the illusion of speed. German strategy was built around the belief that a rapid, decisive campaign could defeat France before the conflict turned into a prolonged struggle. That assumption collapsed within weeks. The German advance was halted, pushed back, and forced into a defensive posture as French and British forces stabilized the front. What emerged was something unprecedented. A continuous battle line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, hundreds of miles long, where neither side could achieve a meaningful breakthrough. Industrial firepower had reshaped warfare. Machine guns and massed artillery made open movement suicidal, and frontal attacks produced staggering losses for minimal territorial gain. In this new reality, survival depended less on maneuver and more on protection. Soldiers began digging not as a temporary measure, but as a necessity. The ground itself became the only reliable defense against the weapons of modern war. The earliest trenches were crude and improvised. Soldiers scraped shallow ditches into the earth, just deep enough to avoid enemy fire, assuming they would soon move on. But as the stalemate persisted, these temporary shelters evolved into permanent systems. Trenches became deeper, wider, and more complex, organized into multiple parallel lines. A frontline trench for combat, a support trench behind it, and a reserve trench further back. Communication trenches connected them, allowing men, supplies, and orders to move undercover. To prevent enemy fire from sweeping through captured sections, trenches were dug in zigzag patterns rather than straight lines. Over time, this underground world expanded into a vast network stretching tens of thousands of miles across the Western Front. What began as a simple hole in the ground turned into a continuous, engineered landscape designed for endurance. The battlefield was no longer defined by open fields, but by earthworks, mud, wire, and the constant threat of artillery raining down from above. German officers adapted quickly to the reality of a long war. Unlike their British and French counterparts, who often treated trenches as temporary obstacles to be overcome, German command increasingly accepted that the conflict would be one of endurance. This mindset shaped how their trenches were built. German positions were typically deeper, with reinforced dugouts, concrete machine gun posts, and shelters sunk far below the surface. Some dugouts reached depths that made them resistant to anything but direct hits. This was not about comfort. It was about survival and control. The German army focused on holding ground efficiently rather than launching costly offensives. Their trench systems reflected a defensive philosophy: absorb enemy attacks, inflict maximum losses, and preserve their own forces. Militarily, it worked. Psychologically, it locked soldiers and officers alike into a war that could be resisted, but not quickly won. If you're drawn to stories where decisions cost lives, consider supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, and stay with us, because the worst is still ahead. German trenches on the Western Front were not random holes in the ground. They were engineered systems designed to keep men alive in an environment dominated by artillery and machine guns. Descriptions from German soldiers and officers reveal firing trenches dug deep enough for men to move unseen, with carefully built firing steps that allowed a soldier to rise, shoot, and disappear again. Sentry positions were protected niches reinforced with sandbags and sometimes steel plates, where rifle barrels could be pushed through narrow slits while the body remained shielded. Communication trenches linked the front line to support and reserve positions, allowing movement under cover and ensuring that the entire system could react quickly to alarms. Below the surface, dugouts evolved into enclosed living quarters. What began as crude shelters became structured spaces with wooden beams, plank-lined walls, and ceilings strong enough to absorb indirect hits. Some German dugouts were built so deep that they were considered nearly bomb-proof against anything but a direct strike. Officers viewed this depth as essential. The trench worked because it reduced exposure. Above ground meant instant vulnerability. Below ground meant a chance, however slim, of survival. From a tactical perspective, German officers understood the logic clearly. The trench system functioned as long as soldiers stayed inside it. The moment men were ordered to leave, protection vanished. Efficiency, therefore, was inseparable from immobility. The trench was not a platform for victory, but a mechanism to endure what could not be escaped. Despite their sophistication, German officers were under no illusion that trenches offered true safety. The same accounts that describe deep shelters also emphasize their limits. Dugouts could withstand shrapnel and near misses, but a direct artillery hit transformed them into traps. Earth collapsed inward, exits vanished, and men were buried alive. Officers recognized that survival depended less on design and more on chance. A shell landing a few meters away could mean safety. One landing directly above could mean annihilation. This awareness shaped how officers spoke about the trench system. It was reliable until it wasn't. The structure reduced risk statistically, but it could never eliminate it. Soldiers might spend weeks untouched, only to be killed instantly by a single shell. That randomness eroded the idea that engineering equaled control. The trench gave the appearance of order in an environment ruled by chaos. German officers understood this contradiction. They commanded men into shelters knowing those same shelters could become coffins under heavy fire. The system's strength was also its weakness. By concentrating men underground, it preserved manpower during bombardments, but it also ensured that when failure occurred, casualties were sudden and total. This reality was rarely spoken of in official language, but it was clearly understood at the front. The trench was a calculated gamble, repeated day after day. It delayed death, but never removed it from the equation. Life inside the trenches followed a grim routine in which death became ordinary. German soldiers described sentries collapsing suddenly, shot by enemy snipers observing through periscopes and binoculars. The response was immediate and mechanical. A bandage was pulled out, applied almost automatically, even when survival was unlikely. Stretchers arrived, maneuvering awkwardly through narrow fire bays. And once the body was removed, the process ended as quickly as it began. Accounts describe how blood pooled on the trench floor, only to be covered with a few shovelfuls of earth. The red stain disappeared, and the trench returned to its previous state. Men went back to watching, cleaning weapons, or waiting. Officers observed how new recruits reacted, pausing, staring, visibly shaken, while veterans barely looked up. Death no longer interrupted life. It was folded into it. This normalization was not indifference, but adaptation. Without it, the trench system could not function. German officers understood that discipline depended on this emotional compression. If every casualty provoked full grief or panic, the system would collapse. The trench demanded emotional economy. Soldiers learned not to ask questions, not to linger. The work of war continued. In this environment, humanity did not disappear, but it was carefully controlled, pushed aside to make survival possible. For German officers, the psychological burden of trench warfare was distinct from that of the enlisted men. They were responsible not only for their own survival, but for managing a system that consumed others. Long stretches of monotony defined trench life, hours and days of silence, broken suddenly by overwhelming violence. Officers spent much of this time observing through binoculars and periscopes, scanning an enemy line that looked eerily similar to their own. Nothing moved, yet danger was constant. They also understood the strategic futility of many orders. Frontal attacks rarely achieved decisive gains. Artillery barrages destroyed ground, but not enemy resolve. Gains were measured in yards, losses in thousands. German officers recognized that the trench was both a solution and a trap. It preserved forces, but it locked the war into a cycle of attrition that favored endurance over brilliance. This awareness produced a kind of mental exhaustion. The trench symbolized a war that could not be won quickly or cleanly. Victory, if it came at all, would be the result of outlasting the enemy, not defeating them outright. Officers carried the knowledge that their role was not to break the stalemate, but to manage it. In that sense, trench warfare demanded patience more than courage, and acceptance more than hope. It was a war measured not by advances, but by how long men could endure remaining exactly where they were. From the German perspective, the trench was the most rational answer to an irrational battlefield. In a war dominated by artillery, machine guns, and industrial firepower, digging deep and holding ground made military sense. German officers understood that well-built trench systems conserved manpower, absorbed enemy attacks, and turned every offensive into a costly gamble for the attacker. As a defensive solution, the trench was close to perfect. It allowed smaller forces to hold vast stretches of front and survive bombardments that would have annihilated troops in the open. Yet this efficiency created a central contradiction. The stronger the defenses became, the more impossible decisive victory grew. Every improvement in protection reduced movement. Every layer of earth and concrete deepened the stalemate. German officers increasingly recognized that the enemy was not just across no man's land, but embedded in time itself. The war was no longer about maneuver or decisive battles, but about endurance, about whose soldiers, industries, and minds would break first. Within this logic, the trench transformed into something more than a military structure. It became a sentence of delayed death. Soldiers might survive for weeks or months, protected underground, only to be killed suddenly by a random shell, a sniper's bullet, or exhaustion. Even survival carried a cost. Physical strain, constant vigilance, and emotional suppression wore men down. Officers saw how discipline replaced hope, how routine replaced fear, and how the war consumed not only bodies, but attention, memory, and meaning. By 1918, this system of attrition could no longer sustain itself. New technologies, most notably tanks, combined with overwhelming Allied numbers, finally broke the static logic of trench warfare. Movement returned, but only after millions had been consumed by a system designed to delay defeat rather than achieve victory. The German officers had understood the truth early on. The trench could hold the line, but it could not end the war. It could only prolong it. And in doing so, it turned survival itself into the final, exhausting objective. But even in a war built on death, something unimaginable happened. If you want to see how the guns fell silent on Christmas Day in World War I, watch the next video.